Hello and welcome to this session of the Educator Unconference on Public Space and Memory. My name is Hana Layson. I'm the head of Youth and Educator Programs at the Portland Art Museum. And I have with me Sabina Haque, an artist here in Portland and an amazing collaborator and educator. I asked Sabina if she would share her work with us. And I wanted to hear and see her response to our thematic question for this conference. How do we use public space to remember?
Thank you, Hana. Thank you for inviting me. So I am really excited today to talk about that question because my whole body of work that I've been doing in Portland and even before is really exploring these stories that are lost, that are forgotten, that are buried in our histories, in our collective minds. So today I'm going to introduce you to three of my projects that explore these forgotten stories. And I feel like my work is about finding ways to remember them and finding ways to commemorate these losses. And as you can tell, it's very dear to my heart because a lot of these stories are really important to who we are and our connection to place. And so I really explore our connection to the places that we call home. And today we're going to look at videos, performances, oral histories, and I'm going to start with a project that I did exploring Portland's history of inclusion and exclusion, specifically east of 82nd in East Portland. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and we're going to see our first project here. I was invited as an artist in residence at the Portland City Archives, and I studied the communities that were not well represented in Portland's official history. So fun fact, Portland official boundaries all the way up until the late 1990s or around that time were only till 82nd Avenue. And I'm not going to go any further because I'm going to talk more about that in this amazing video documentation of this 2-year project that actually ended up expanding to multiple other placekeeping projects. But all this work was based in East Portland, east of 82nd, and I collaborated with the PANO, the Asian Pacific Islander Organization. And this picture that you see here is from the Portland City Archives, and you can see it's dated from 1934, when they were widening the road to make it the freeway to connect the city. It was one of the first freeways in the city. And so you can see over time, I've collaged all these different cultural and economic signs of change along this route. So we're going to look at this video. So that's what really drew me to this project was their call to the artists to come and spend a whole year researching, and this was the question they asked: what communities within the city are not as well represented in the official record? And that drew me to this idea of how do you document something that's undocumented? How do you search for the hidden stories? How do you look for that in a bunch of piles of demographics, maps? And maps are something that I personally find extremely telling, and they really sort of shape and tell a story, and often a very specific story, and often from a very specific official perspective, especially when you're looking at annexation maps like I did from the 1980s.
So let's go back to when you started. You arrive in this archive full of charts and data and maps, and your job is to find out what's not in the archive. How do you do that?
Well, you start looking for names of people that lived and worked on this, and residents and testimonies at city meetings, because I wanted to not only find out what the story was, but also why it wasn't actually actively known in the community. People don't really know how annexation went down, how the city went about it, which was more of what I was looking at. What is the responsibility of a city to its citizens? And in turn, what is the responsibility of the citizen to the city? And how does that work together? So I wanted to have oral histories.
I think what you were seeing in the 80s is a result of the agreement with Multnomah County leaders, elected leaders, City of Portland leaders, to have us annexed. It was done as an intergovernmental agreement. Intergovernmental agreements mean that two elected leaders can sit in their room at that point and write the agreement, and there's no public process. There were this group of people out there that appeared to be $7.50 each coming into the city of Portland. So it was like a giant grant program for the city of Portland.
In 1986, East County has its municipal services cut. Police, park, and planning services are no longer under the jurisdiction of Multnomah County.
I have studied the situation and determined that the only way for East County to receive necessary urban services is through joining the City of Portland.
Now, as you mentioned, you talked to some people who were really present, politically active at that time, but this is 30 plus years ago now when the annexation started. How many people did you talk to who live there now who really had no idea what had happened?
Well, that's a very interesting part of this whole story of the East Portland portrait. I'm trying to create a portrait of this community. At the same time, we were having an influx of refugees that were coming in the 80s, and they were coming from Vietnam, and then later on from Somalia, and later on from the Ukraine. And so it's just every decade, from every trauma that the world experienced, we had all the refugee communities, that support networks in East Portland. So that's where they all ended up. So these people are living there now, mixed in with the previous demographics of the white population, and they don't know this history of why we don't have sidewalks, why we got sewers in 2010, right? That's when the sewer project finally ended. So there are efforts right now that grassroots organizations are working heavily on, and I decided to partner with them. And so I have a multi-partner project where APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network, is a statewide grassroots organization, and the show is actually based in their community space. And they connected me with Laotian immigrants who are working for justice in that neighborhood. They connected me with a lot of young people who don't know the story but are interested in finding out the roots of the systemic neglect.
You sound more like a social activist or a historian than like an artist. Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, I think the best artists, the ones who are really connecting with the issues and living outside of the bubble, are actually doing that kind of work. We really need to move out of the sphere of the museum, the public institution. My story is the story of a color. I mean, I came here when I was 17. I had never lived in the United States before. And it's really important to get those stories out, those undocumented stories that are not in the mainstream, that are not in the official record of the city. How do we get them out to a larger population? And the history of that, again, going back to my own personal history, you don't know where you're going to go if you don't know where you've been. The ideas that I'm looking at are really about how do we create voice for people? How do we create a city that actually is going to be inclusive for all? And truly listen to the stories that are in the communities. And that's what this show is about, with oral histories, film, and a theater project that worked with Harrison Park Schools, and they did a shadow theater on belonging. And this beautiful sort of image of these kids working through different phases of compromise, rejection, isolation, and finally coming to some kind of inclusionary way of living together. that was a project that took place over a span of 3-4 years and continues as we speak. And it really kind of shows you my approach in how to investigate these spaces and these places. And starting with the people, interviewing the people. And I'm really privileged to have interviewed some of those folks. Bonnie, one of the activists, has now passed away. And so her story has been recorded. And it's actually in the archive now. And she was listed in the documents in the archive, but her story was not there. But now her version is. And I'm really excited about that. So anyway, I don't know why I'm so emotional today about how do we remember these lost stories, but they're really important. And how do we, as artists, continue to find that creative space and create voice for people that have lost it? Hana, do you have any comments, or should we move on to the next one?
Well, just that I really appreciate, I feel like this work is showing how art can play an important role in creating inclusive spaces, in bringing forward stories that haven't been part of the official history. And also your work is demonstrating how important it is that we have experiences of public memory. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the role of youth here. I guess if this is part of the research you did, I wondered about how kids and schools were impacted by annexation, and then also if you could just share a little more on the kinds of projects that you facilitated and taught with students.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a huge question, but I will try to address it. What you see here actually is my next project that came out of the project before, the performance you saw with the kids. It was using shadow play, and it was called Belonging, the first iteration. And what we explored with the schools and the school children on the border of Portland, Harrison Park is one of the most diverse schools in Portland Public. And it is only one of the schools that's on the border of this line of called 82nd. We have 7 other school districts that aren't part of the city of Portland. So like Rose Park and David Douglas, they're actually not part of Portland Public. So we have this dividing line between old Portland, circa 1950s, which then divides the schools into these different categories. So when I worked with these youth, we talked about how certain kids had access to schools, how they felt like connected to it, how different communities were segregated according to race. We looked at the history of renters and the history of redlining in Portland. So we brought all that information to them in their 5th grade class, if you can imagine. And they were really excited, and they wanted to create visual representations of what it meant to be excluded and what it meant to be part of a group. And so what you see there in those visuals of them performing, and I don't want to go here, I'm just going to go back here. They're performing and using their body in this gesture of welcoming, where their hands are coming open, and then there's these gestures of pushing away. And that became really symbolic to me in the next project. So through working with youth around these really, really systemic, racist, structural things that had gone on in Portland and across the United States with housing and immigration rights and rights of folks of color, I started to explore this, my own history, which is complicated. I'm mixed race. My mom is white from Ohio, and my father is from Pakistan. And I was raised in Pakistan, so I didn't grow up, and I was not educated in the United States. And my family still lives overseas, including my mother. So with that, I'm going to lead into this next project, which ended up being a 3-year project as well and continues in different iterations. And it's based off of a theatrical performance that you see here with, I curated the shadow dancer, and they performed and then were animated into a projection. And then we had live dancers that interacted with this idea of how we move through space. And these maps that you see here are maps of the Sonoran Desert on the border of Mexico and the desert and the beautiful mountain passes between India and Pakistan, which is the border regions where my parents, my father and my grandmother and I grew up. So let's take a look at this short 3-minute video. I live between two worlds. I was raised in Pakistan by my Muslim father and my white American mother. My mother's family immigrated to the USA in 1904 from Norway. The idea for my show started when I was confronted by the words, "If you don't like it here, go back to your own country." Those words were spoken by a close family member. Go back to your own country are words we hear often in today's political climate. Many anti-immigration regulations and laws continue to be enacted, pushing the newcomer out. My show, called Unbelonging, explores this cycle of welcoming and excluding and what it means to belong to a community. What is that urge that makes one push the next newcomer out of the country? Gestures of welcoming and excluding are performed by an animated shadow figure, and a live dancer interacts with the silhouette and the mapped borderlines. I collaborated with 3 performers of color to choreograph movement to respond to the projected shadow figures and the borderlines. This gallery installation includes 15 suspended life-size ink drawings of silhouetted bodies and maps of contested borderlines on layered sheets of Duralar. The viewers move between drawings depicting the mountains of Kashmir disrupted by the lines of control at the Pakistan and India border. The river and the line of control runs right through the center of the page. Other silhouetted figures navigate the liminal space of the Sonoran Desert. The US-Mexico border cuts through the landscape drawn on the river side. I picked these 2 borders, the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, Mexico, and Kashmir on the border between India and Pakistan, because I live between these 2 worlds. My 10-year-old father crossed the newly made border between India and Pakistan in 1947, along with 15 million people in the world's largest migration of the century. I explore the cycle of welcoming and excluding and what it means to belong in a community. The experience of my relatives saying, go back to your own country if you don't like it, they themselves came here. We have the box that my grandmother brought in 1904 from Ellis Island, right? We have the documents. Why do we, once we get that passport of belonging, why is it so easy to then push the next newcomer, the next refugee, the next immigrant out? And that's kind of also commemorating that story of those lost and forgotten stories of migration. And those are so important, especially in the subcontinent where we don't have a single museum commemorating this huge event. This was like the largest land migration that we've had in this century. We had 1.5 to 2 million people killed in ethnic violence. My family barely made it out of India to Pakistan, and so many families that were located in British India were also trapped on either side of these borders. So my work is always reflecting on that memory and bringing it up and trying to find those ways of like finding healing, questioning the way that we forget, in a sense. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with this project in its current state. Hana, do you have any comments about this work?
Well, thank you for sharing this, and something that I really appreciate about your work, and that I was thinking about also when I was able to be in this installation, is what you do with our bodies, how you ask your viewers, how you create bodily experiences for us, and how that is part of the work of inclusion. Do you want to say more about that?
I think it's an excellent observation that several people have brought up. It's an embodied practice. Before I went to art school, I didn't know what that meant. But I know from a very young age, the way that I navigated the world was to literally act it out. And so with my art, I kind of like go through these setups, and I go through these projections, and I go through these spaces, and I cut them, and I collage them, and I arrange them. And I create these spaces then that you can move through and reflect on. Like, you can go through that curtain, you can go through that passage, you can touch that shadow. Kids, I don't have all the documentation, obviously, in this short talk, but there were so many fun things that happened in that space, and also just that experience of being able to move through a space that's been created for the viewer to engage in. The same thing with my workshops, which I do with the youth. And we're experiencing the work by making it, and by acting it out with our bodies, and by performing it, and by brainstorming it, and then seeing how it feels in our bodies again. And that goes back to my earlier work, which I showed, I think, 2 years ago at the Portland Art Museum, where I wrapped my body in the American flag as a shroud in reference to the Iraq War and the Gulf War. I was acting out my feelings in an embodied practice. So it's been a way that I've always worked. Even though I say I'm a visual artist, I do engage with the body and with the active performance as a tool to explore memory and to explore my current memory in my body. Because that's like a history that goes back all the way to my grandparents and my great-grandparents that have come from all over. So thank you for that observation. So the last project is really about a celebration, and I wanted to bring you into, I am now doing public art in the age of COVID. All my gallery work, including that show that you saw, was installed for no one to see except through videos. So it was very challenging to work this last year, but I took on a project in Seattle. And this is not the actual work, but it's a design because this is going to be installed in less than 3 weeks. On August 16th, I'm going to be taking an 8-foot lattice that I've designed for this space, and we're going to have the faces of 60 community members that live in in Lake City, which is just north of the city. And actually, Lake City has a very interesting history. It used to be outside of the corporation limits of Seattle, and there used to be a lot of different strip clubs and all kinds of other bootlegging happened in this, in the 40s, and all that happened outside. And now, of course, there's a huge immigrant community, a huge community of folks of color that live there. And it has a really interesting history. And I'm going to take you to some of the folks that I've got the chance to meet, and I want to be able to share that. So I'm going to do that right now. Give me 1 second. So this is Lake City, the public library, which is the plaza, which is a community center area. And there's lots of young kids that go there. And during COVID, I talked to a lot of people on Zoom. And that's how we got to know each other this year. It was all on Zoom, and I met a ton of folks. This is where the sculpture will be installed, and this is also where in the summertime they've been having the farmers markets, and there's a playground over here. So it's really the sculpture and the monument, especially this discussion around monuments, who needs to be remembered, who needs to be celebrated, who needs to be recognized. These are the people that I want to recognize. This is Hema. She's a 12-year-old little Indian American girl. She was born in Lake City, and her family, her younger brother is only 2, and they have family in southern India, and they are very much involved in the community. This is the Hayashi family, and her family, and she was born on the farm. That street that you saw in front of the library is now called Hayashi Street. It wasn't called that 5 years ago. And in 1942, Grandma Hayashi was removed from her land and interned, and never, ever was compensated with that land ever again. And so this is her portrait. It will be remembered, and her story will be remembered as well in this sculpture that I'm making. This is her daughter, Bonnie, who is present with us today and lives in the community or nearby, and has been involved in the renaming of the street where my sculpture will be residing for the next year. And this is Athena, a young high school student at the neighbors. So I worked with high school students. I worked with community members at the education center across the street. And I said, I'm doing this project. Would you like to be involved? And I wanted it to be as multi-generational as possible. And I was like, I will paint your portrait. And as soon as people said that, they were like, I got over 60 photographs. People texted me photographs. They were so excited to be featured. And they sent me all of their family members and their cousins, everyone that lived within their community and their sphere. So this is truly a project about the people who live in Lake City, and I'm really excited to have it installed and invite everybody, because they've been text messaging me over the last 4 months about when is their project going to be ready. So as you can see, we have a ton of pictures here. I have been painting many, many hours this summer to complete the 60 portraits. And as you can tell, we are getting to the end of this talk. These are images that you can see of all the folks that I've worked with and their celebration. So with that, I'm going to end our talk. And I'd love to hear from Hana about this last piece about commemorating and remembering the people who have lived there in the 1940s all the way up to today, the little 2-year-old from India who migrated there a year ago.
It's just such wonderful work, Sabina, and it's really great to see how you are bringing forward. I mean, in one way, what you're saying is that our our public spaces maybe should be less devoted to honoring presidents or, whoever, those individuals, and perhaps we should be using them to bring forward the stories of ordinary people and young people and old people, and also to remember injustices, right? Like the
Right, what
Japanese
happened
internment.
And I think what's interesting when you really think about the word ordinary people, you and I, we're ordinary people. Hayashi's, they're ordinary people. Hema is an ordinary person. But we all have extraordinary stories. We've all lived our lives to the fullest. We've all had so many things happen that have to be remembered, that are part of a bigger fabric. And that's what I want to honor. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you so much.
Thanks for everything. And thank you, John, for all your support and for the museum and for this wonderful conference that you've organized, Hana. Thank you again. Appreciate this lovely talk and sharing with my community. Thank you. Bye-bye.